Sorry, trying to unmute myself there. So thanks, Hedda. I'm Nikki. If folks are interested in a sort of more detailed introduction to the project or to our consultations, which inform the framework, or want to learn more about who we are and our office, check out that link for the January 14th session that we held, the Introduction to Working in Good Ways. And we had a much lengthier introduction there. And so we're just going to kind of try to skip through that to save more time for summarizing the principles that we're sharing and our reflection activities, but feel free to check out a more detailed intro at that link that I just saw Annie throw in the chat, or join our mailing list, as Hedda said. Okay, so just gonna hop in here. So as you might recall, if you were at the session a couple of weeks ago, we introduced this pathway, which Hedda talked about a little bit earlier. And you'll remember that what we talked about was that, you know, institutions like our university often focus on stages 2 to 4. So that's like initiating a partnership, maintaining a partnership, and closing a partnership. And what happens is the first and last stage that we learned about in our consultations are often ignored. So in our last session, we looked at the work before the work. And as you can see in the work before the work, there are a couple of key principles, and literacy is one of those principles, along with critical self-reflection and relationship building. And so this week, we're going to look more closely at that principle of literacy. And this is, along with reflection and relationship building and all 7 principles, these are things that do, you know, continue throughout the process. So it doesn't just happen during the work before the work. As we're going to learn today, you develop and maintain your literacy, and that's a lifelong process. So we're just going to jump into things. And as always, we're going to start with a story, which we hope kind of contextualizes this principle for you. Okay, so I started my career working for a Métis consulting firm back in 2011. And when I was working with that organization, I was mentored in Indigenous research and community engagement by a small group of Métis and First Nations women. And I'm so grateful for that. And then back in 2014, a few years into the work that I was doing, my colleague, a Swampy Cree researcher, and I were consulting with several Cree communities in northern Manitoba. So we had approached each of the communities in advance to arrange a visit. We had followed the protocols for initiating relationships, like contacting chief and council, letting them know about our trip, asking permission to visit, essentially. And there was a liaison waiting for us in each of the communities, or expecting us, I should say. So anyways, we had prepared these gifts of tobacco for all the people that we were meeting, including the liaisons. So during the first 3 community visits that we had made in northern Manitoba, everything went really smoothly. It was excellent. We were doing consultations on a particular subject. So then anyways, we go into our final of the 4 communities, and we meet with the liaison, and we sit down to have a chat with them. And at that point, I still wasn't very comfortable passing tobacco, but I sort of tentatively held out this, like, you know, nice hexagonal box of organic tobacco. And my colleague said the words and thanked the liaison. And then our contact, like, took the box from us. There was like a really lengthy pause. And then she replied, "Thanks, but I don't smoke." So she likely knew what the tobacco signified, but she was gently chiding us and kind of reminding us that it wasn't appropriate to be passing tobacco to everybody in that particular community. And so to this day, even right now, folks, I can feel this like knot in my stomach when I think about that story, about how awkward it was, and how it almost derailed everything. Just this like really sort of moment of us not knowing sort of how to move past this kind of this error, this misstep, really. And so it is a reminder for me constantly, though, right, that I have to do my homework, and that I have to learn about the history and the culture and the protocols for each particular community, and to really avoid taking a pan-Indigenous approach. Like, obviously we assumed, because all of these communities were Northern Cree communities within relatively short distances, that they would sort of follow the same protocols and have the same culture, and it just wasn't true. So it was a huge lesson to me, and something that I remember often. But so anyways, I hope that this story sets the tone for what we're about to talk about, and we're going to circle back to this story a little later too. Okay, so, and some folks might have similar experiences to that, you know, like we've all been there, or perhaps some of us have been there. Um, but yeah, it was a really uncomfortable moment. Okay, so today we're going to talk about what do we mean when we talk about literacy? Why do we bother developing literacy in Indigenous topics? And then how we actually can go about it. And then we're going to have a bit of a reflection period at the end of the session today, where we can sort of grapple a little bit more with this topic. Okay, so what do we mean by literacy? As Hedda mentioned earlier, this framework reframes this notion of partnerships and emphasizes the importance of building relationships with Indigenous people and communities and prospective partners. And if we are interested in developing those relationships with Indigenous peoples and communities, we have to take on this responsibility to educate ourselves. So, literacy means developing and maintaining a basic knowledge and understanding of Indigenous histories, cultures, and experiences. Beyond that, we use this literacy to meaningfully support Indigenous self determination and challenge colonial systems and practices. But it's also that having this literacy helps us engage with our partners and Indigenous people and communities generally with, you know, empathy, compassion, knowledge, awareness, and some ethics. So I just want to acknowledge Carrie Miller here. So Carrie Miller, the department head of Native Studies here at the University of Manitoba, offers a summer institute on literacy and Indigenous topics. And so this is sort of where this language of developing literacy came from, because we've heard about proficiency, we've heard about, you know, developing competency, but literacy, I think, is something that's much more attainable. Is that we know about these things generally, we have a basic knowledge. And then for those who attended the last session a couple of weeks ago, you might remember this survey that we filled in. It was things like the things the Indigenous partners we consulted with identified as important areas for us to do some learning. So the colonial project, including the histories and legacies of colonization and the reality of ongoing colonialism, Indigenous resistance and resurgence, both historic and present day, and then also community-specific histories, cultures, and practices. Because again, we have to avoid that, you know, pan-Indigenous approach of assuming that all communities are the same, and also this assumption I think a lot of us make that Indigenous cultures themselves are stagnant and haven't evolved or don't evolve. So anyways, this is a quote here from our colleague Filiberto Penados, who is actually a partner of Annie Chen's in the work that she did in Belize. And so he said, when we talk about colonialism, we often think about a period, but actually it's like a frame, a way of looking at the world. Colonialism is a way of thinking that continues today. You see it operating in all kinds of ways. Those very same assumptions, that underlying logic, could be at the foundation of our engagement with Indigenous peoples, and that is what we have to avoid. So for me, this really sort of, you know, underpins the importance of developing literacy, is that we don't even realize, right, that we have this frame, this colonial frame that we are using in our engagement with Indigenous communities. And so the more that we know, the more ethically we can engage. So this is now the why. Why develop and maintain our literacy in Indigenous topics? So we develop and maintain literacy to build a foundation for better understanding and adapting to the different ways that Indigenous communities work and relate to others. Because knowing helps to contextualize the contemporary experiences of Indigenous peoples in Canada in the history of colonization and ongoing colonialism. And the partner of literacy, which is reflection, which we're going to look at in 2 weeks from now at the next session, will help you situate yourself within that history and the ongoing colonial project. So those things kind of go hand in hand too, right? Along with literacy, we need to do the reflection work, which we'll talk about in a couple of weeks. Also, we develop and maintain literacy to challenge ongoing racism and colonialism within universities and other institutions, because literacy is a framework through which we can understand what we see and hear and feel and experience while in community, and because it helps us to repair any missteps we might make, like my mistake of pan-indigenizing and bringing tobacco into a community where it wasn't appropriate. We develop and maintain literacy because a lack of Indigenous literacy results in increased stress and anxiety about community engagement. So we're so worried about saying something wrong or doing something wrong or being offensive that we just don't actually even bother building the relationships that this work requires of us or engaging with Indigenous communities at all. Because shirking our responsibility to develop and maintain Indigenous literacy will dramatically increase the work of our colleagues and Indigenous partners, who then have the added task to make sure that we know what is like widely available out there. So they have to take on this role of educating us. And we heard in our consultations, one of the community partners that we met with shared this quote with us. We had to do a lot of education and that was strenuous on us. So this is happening. We're going into communities and as community engaged learning practitioners, we're sending students into communities and they don't have that foundation that they need to have to engage in good ways with community. And so they're approaching community and they might have some racism or prejudice. And then communities are dealing with that. So it's like we're actively harming them by not developing our literacy. And then finally, because we can demonstrate our commitment to working in good ways by engaging in self-directed learning and making use of like the remarkable number of educational resources and opportunities that Indigenous people have already produced. And our effort to do this, to develop our literacy in Indigenous topics, shows that we actually care, right? That we're willing to do the work to work in good ways. Okay. This last slide here is about how we can develop our literacy in Indigenous topics. So learn from Indigenous teachers and sources. So that means prioritizing Indigenous knowledge and scholarship, seeking out Indigenous writing, art, and media. It's a good reminder that the wrong sources are going to simply reinforce any preconceived ideas we already have. So if we're not actively seeking Indigenous media, the bulk of our learning is going to come from news and media and public narratives that often perceive and portray Indigenous people in stereotypical, fear-mongering, or oppressive ways. So seek out resources that Indigenous people have produced. And again, a reminder here that this does not mean that we should expect our Indigenous partners or colleagues to educate us. We should not expect them to have all the answers or frankly, any of the answers. It's very common that, Indigenous colleagues at the university get approached with questions that have nothing to do with their own like histories and cultures, and they're expected to know all about it. Like I know very little about what goes on in West Coast or East Coast communities, for instance, but folks always are asking those questions like we should know. And then seek out Indigenous teachers who are doing this work or are willing to take on the emotional labor of educating others. And if you do that, then make sure they're properly remunerated as well. So there are folks out there who are willing to do the education work for colleagues and partners, and let's make sure they're being paid to do that work because it's not easy. The second point here of how to develop literacy, learn through experience in relationship with community and on the land. So this is really about privileging Indigenous pedagogies. So how we learn matters, and it's particularly important to demonstrate our readiness to learn in Indigenous ways. So from hands-on experience, in relationship with community, through story and observation, from the land, in ceremony, and more. In this way, we avoid privileging academic knowledge and actually start building relationships while we're learning too, because we're learning in community and we're learning experientially. Find Indigenous groups and spaces and events that welcome non-Indigenous participation. So the last part of that's really important. And then another little caveat here for this piece is like, make sure that you're leaving space for Indigenous participation at these Indigenous events and groups and spaces. So sometimes when we take part in those events, we actually are using up resources or displacing Indigenous people. And so we have to make sure that we have humility about our access and like center and make space for Indigenous participation, even if that means that we can just observe in those places. And then the third bullet here on how to develop our literacy is to avoid pan-Indigenous approaches, which I've been hammering from the beginning. So pan-Indigenous approaches where we treat all Indigenous communities as though they're alike are incompatible with cultivating and developing or demonstrating literacy in Indigenous topics. So it's really important to take the time to learn about nation and community specific knowledges, histories, and experiences. And to know that the different historical experiences and even small distances that separate some communities can result in major social, cultural, or political differences between those communities, and that there are even big differences between individuals within or groups within the same community. So an example that we heard about in our consultations was Norway House and Cross Lake, which are two Cree communities, which are separated by a mere 115 kilometers. But even still, during consultations, we heard from a Norway House Cree band member who said, it's different, our culture, it's different from Cross Lake, how we do things. We have our own ways. A norm for us is not a norm for other communities. So a really good reminder too, right? And then also that individuals might have different protocols too, right? So in the community that I visited, some folks accepted tobacco and others didn't. Okay, so and then continuing on with the pan-Indigenous approaches, developing community and nation specific literacy helps us to avoid that embarrassment and harm that comes from ignorant pan-Indigenous approaches. So what essentially my colleague and I did. So remembering that story from that I told, it resulted in embarrassment, awkwardness, and discomfort for everybody. And like I said too, it was like it was appropriate for some people but not for everyone, and so we should have actually checked in with people as individuals first, literally asking them what an appropriate protocol for each person would have been, because then we could drop the appropriate gifts. So understanding those nuances, like how folks are different within communities or how communities are different, changes how we might approach certain community members, the protocols we follow, the kinds of gifts we might bring, and will ultimately set the tone for that relationship. So in that case, if I had known that tobacco wasn't appropriate for that person, we would have brought another gift. So in which case we actually had, luckily, but we might not have had it, which would have been even worse than it already was. And then so one final note before we move into our reflection piece for today's workshop is to remember that maintaining our literacy in Indigenous topics is an ongoing and lifelong responsibility. So cultures are dynamic, they evolve, they change. We need to keep ourselves educated about changing context. There's new things happening daily. Protocols change as well. The visions of the communities that we work with are constantly changing as well. So we have to keep learning, keep listening and sharing, and keep showing up for community. Okay, so we're gonna move into the reflection piece in just a moment. So we're gonna go into some breakout rooms and have some discussions, but first I'm just wanted to tell another little story and have a little chat, and then we'll go into those rooms. So when I first started working at the university about 3 years ago, my colleagues and I were sort of philosophizing about the privileges of having access to knowledge. And so one of my colleagues was arguing that, you know, it's unjust that knowledge is held in universities because there's very limited public access to that knowledge. So meaning that like all of these books that are in university libraries that the public can't really access because they're in university spaces. And while I agree with this, I would also acknowledge that this is a Western perspective on what constitutes knowledge and where knowledge is held, because within an Indigenous paradigm, you might say that knowledge is stored in our matriarchs and our elders, in our stories and in the oral record, and in all of these other knowledge holders as well, right? So I want us to sort of think about that, to think about alternatives to where we think knowledge comes from. And so for the next little bit, I'm hoping that we're going to reflect on what we consider to be the most sort of legitimate forms of education, or who we consider to be the most expert or authoritative teachers and educators, and why it is we think that, right? and we're going to go into our breakout rooms. We're going to talk about these questions. So what are some ways we can learn? What are forms of education we've participated in or would be willing to participate in? What are challenges we might experience as we try to develop our literacy in Indigenous topics and how to overcome them? And one of them might be that some of these forms of learning aren't familiar to us, right? But anyways, when we come back from the discussion, we're going to share a list of on-campus and other resources that will support your literacy development and relationship building. And we're also going to share a list of the literacy topics that partners told us we should learn about, which we call the literacy homework. So we'll share those two things when we come back. But for now, I think Annie is going to move us into breakout rooms. Anything my colleagues want to say before we go?
Yeah, I put the questions in the chat, folks, so that you'll have them in the breakout room. I think one thing I would invite you to think about as well for question number 3 is to think about the challenges, but also to think about the responsibilities, right? So sometimes people will have a sense of entitlement to Indigenous knowledge, but we don't. As Indigenous, non-Indigenous people, we don't have any entitlement to Indigenous knowledges. And so sometimes we might see a challenge, but then what we have to meet with that challenge is our responsibility. And we also have to meet it with humility in knowing that, in fact, no one has to share their knowledge with us. And I think, Nikki can speak to across Indigenous nations, but I've seen the humility that some of my Indigenous colleagues approach, and we have Indigenous and non-Indigenous people working together, but also Indigenous peoples across nations are working together and show that humility to each other too that I've seen. All right, so that's just one thing I wanted to add, but we'll invite folks to go into breakout rooms now.
I hope everyone had a good conversation, and we can continue some of those conversations in the community engagement advising hour, if folks want to. So
yeah, I just want to say that it's so nice to see all the faces in the screen, because I see people that I recognize from before. I might not know your name, I might not remember where I've seen you, but I recognize you, so it's just nice.
Yeah, it was really interesting. Actually, I was in the same group today with a few people that we were in a group with 2 weeks ago. So it's really interesting now to sort of continue some of these conversations and get to know folks a bit better. Yeah. So we're all back now. I'm seeing from Annie. And so I'm actually just going to quickly share my screen. We've got a little resource list we wanted to share with you, and I know that Jerry Ducharme is here from the Center for the Center for the Advancement of Teaching and Learning. Jerry is going to be guest advising at the next hour from 1 to 2. So I'm might have other resources and things to share with folks if you do want to stick around. But for now, and I see Annie just shared a PDF. Let me see if I can share my screen.
Nikki, I'll also need you to drop the other PDF you have, the one
sure.
in the homework.
Yeah, okay, we'll do. From current slide. Okay, so like I said, I hope that folks had fruitful conversations in their small groups. And we can continue some of these conversations maybe in the next hour if they're relevant. But for now, we just wanted to share a couple of resources with you. So things happening on campus and other events. So here's a little list of things happening at the University of Manitoba. Fireside chats on Tuesdays. The Indigenous Student Center is also hosting a virtual sharing circle and teaching event this year. There is the Indigenous Scholar Speaker Series that happens, I think, on Thursdays once a month in the winter term, if I'm correct. The Unsettling Ideas Book Club Winnipeg chapter. So folks in my group, we were talking about Chelsea Vowell's Indigenous Rights. This, they looked at that book in this book club. And so you could probably see some of that discussion still on their Facebook group. But anyways, Native Studies also has their Fall Winter Colloquium series, which now during COVID is broadcast on Facebook Live and in other places, I'm sure. So check that out too. There are Intro to Native Studies courses for credit as well. And if you're a staff at the University of Manitoba, you can get some like course fees back, tuition back. And then the Literacy and Indigenous Content Summer Course developed by Dr. Carrie Miller, who's the head of the Department of Native Studies. And then there is a list here of other events taking place. So check that out. Typically sort of one-off events or events like our own here as well. And then just some documents. And then again, there's lots of stuff coming out of the Center for the Advancement of Teaching and Learning, or just the center as it's called. Leah Fontaine and Jerry Ducharme. Jerry is here with us today and will be sticking around for the next hour. And they have a list of resources too. Oh, and then here you see Indigenous Rights by Chelsea Vowell for folks who are asking about her name and the book title. And then again, that great course developed by the University of Alberta, Indigenous Canada. So if anyone knows Dan Levy or the show Schitt's Creek, he watched this and got a bunch of people to join, and it's an excellent course, sort of really comprehensive, broad overview. So check that out as well, please. I'm just going to come out of share mode so that I can drop, I'm going to drop, the Indigenous Rights Book Club is excellent. I'm just seeing some stuff. So I'm dropping now this homework document. So this is, we said we would share this at the last session. This is literally just a sort of a large list of the things that are the community partners and Indigenous staff and faculty and practitioners that we consulted with over the course of a few years to develop this framework. These were the things they told us that folks should know about. So again, they're in the area of colonial history, the ongoing colonial project, Indigenous governance, resistance and resurgence, specific things about particular Indigenous communities too, right? So actually not on this list, but in our assessment guide, which is part of the framework, we ask the questions even like, how does this particular community's economy look? How do they pay for things? What are the costs like? So it's like really understanding the dynamics in each community too that you might be working in addition to sort of the broad strokes that are contained in this document. So we call it literacy homework, but it's really just a series of questions about, do you know this? Do you have knowledge in this area? Could you engage with community members on these topics? If somebody asks you about the 60s scoop, do you have the capacity to engage with them? In compassionate ways and in knowledgeable ways on those subjects. So anyways, that's it. We're about to sort of end this part of the session and move into our community engagement advising hour. So I'll just pull up the screen share so you can see our last little bits. So the community engagement advising answer, if you want to stay on the call, you can take a little break, obviously stretch, go grab a coffee, take a washroom break. But we stick around for another hour to share more stories, talk about our experiences, answer questions, hear your comments about kind of the first hour. And develop this community of practice of folks working with Indigenous communities at the university or other institutions. I know there are folks here who are not University of Manitoba staff. And then just to let you know, upcoming events. So on Thursday, February 25th, in 2 weeks, we'll be doing the session on reflection, which again is sort of this partner of literacy. They go hand in hand. And we'll be launching the framework guide in April, Working in Good Ways. And so that framework guide is much more detailed. It has assessment questions, it has more advice, and it has, we're providing kind of a summary of what's contained within each chapter here in these sessions. And then if you have any questions or feedback or input or want to talk to me about something that happened at these sessions or ask questions, shoot me an email. If you join our mailing list, you'll also get those directly from my email so you can reply to them. But here, Annie, I think we'll drop the mailing list URL. And again, please feel free to join that. We'll be sharing the links to the YouTube video recordings of these sessions and whatnot. So, okay. So I think that's it for today. I want to just thank everyone for joining and invite my colleagues if they want to say any last words. No, okay. Hedda, mute.
Last words, not yet, not today.
Okay. So again, folks, thanks for joining. I appreciate you joining us over your lunch hour. And again, feel free to eat your lunch actually during these sessions if you're joining again in a couple of weeks. But if not, stick around. We're going to start the next piece any second. So Annie, do you want to stop the recording?